Everyone thinks World War II soldiers were heroes living on hearty military rations and sleeping in cozy barracks between glorious battles. But what actually happened when you opened your can of meat and vegetables would make today's worst cafeteria food look like a 5-star meal. In fact, you'd spend most of your time hungry, cold, and wondering if that brown chunk floating in your soup was supposed to be edible, or if it had crawled in there on its own. You'd wake up one morning in a foxhole filled with 3 inches of freezing water, realize your socks had rotted off your feet, and discover that your breakfast consisted of hardtack so stale it could stop a bullet. What happened next determined whether you'd have the energy to survive another day, or if you'd join the countless soldiers who simply gave up trying to choke down another spoonful of reconstituted horror. Hello, before you settle in, I'd truly appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with what I'm sharing here. It means so much to me. Also, please share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always touched to see how we're all coming together from across the globe. Now let's create a calm space. Lower the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for a gentle hum, and let's begin this journey together. Welcome to your new reality. You're a wanty soldier, and congratulations. You've just discovered that everything you thought you knew about military life was a carefully crafted lie designed to get you to sign up. Your first meal as a soldier isn't the hearty stew your recruiter promised. It's something called spam and lima beans, though the lima beans look suspiciously like small rocks, and the spam has achieved a colour that doesn't exist in nature. You stare at your mess kit, a shallow metal bowl that will serve as your plate, your cup, and occasionally your helmet when things get really desperate. The soldier next to you, a veteran of exactly 3 weeks, leans over with the wisdom of the ages. Pro tip, rookie, he says, stirring his mysterious brown substance with a spoon that's seen better decades. Don't look at it too long or you'll lose your nerve. Just shovel it in and pretend it's your mum's cooking. But here's where things get really interesting. Your mum's cooking, however questionable, was made with ingredients that were actually meant for human consumption. Military rations were designed by committees of people who apparently believed that nutrition was more important than taste, texture, or basic human dignity. The primary goal wasn't to make you happy. It was to keep you alive long enough to be useful, and sometimes, just sometimes, they achieved that goal. Your breakfast consists of something called K-rations, and if you've never experienced the joy of K-rations, imagine eating cardboard that's been soaked in salt water and then dried in the sun for several months. The crackers, and I use that term loosely, have the consistency of compressed sawdust. You need both hands and considerable determination to break off a piece small enough to fit in your mouth. And once you do, you'll need to chew it for approximately 17 minutes before it becomes soft enough to swallow. The canned meat is perhaps even more mysterious. The label claims it's beef, but you're pretty sure beef isn't supposed to be that uniform shade of grey-pink. It slides out of the can in one solid, perfectly cylindrical piece, maintaining the exact shape of its container with an almost supernatural dedication to geometric precision. When you poke it with your spoon, it jiggles slightly, like it's laughing at your misfortune. Now you might be thinking, at least I'm getting protein. And technically, you're correct. You're getting protein in the same way that leather boots contain protein. It's there, but your body isn't entirely sure what to do with it. The texture is what food scientists would politely call challenging, and what normal human beings would describe as absolutely horrifying. But wait, it gets worse. You discover that military coffee isn't actually coffee in any recognizable sense. It's a brown liquid that contains caffeine and optimism, though mostly just disappointment. It's been sitting in a pot since approximately 1943, growing stronger and more bitter with each passing year. The taste combines the worst aspects of burnt rubber and profound regret, with just a hint of despair for flavour. You take a sip and immediately understand why so many soldiers took up smoking. When your taste buds have been completely obliterated by military coffee, cigarettes start to seem like a reasonable life choice. At least tobacco has a consistent flavour profile, unlike whatever's happening in your cup. The dining experience itself deserves special mention. You're not sitting at a table with proper chairs, enjoying civilized conversation. You're crouched in a muddy trench, trying to eat while rain drips steadily into your food, surrounded by the sounds of warfare and the even more disturbing sounds of your fellow soldiers attempting to digest their rations. Someone 3 trenches over is making noises that suggest his stomach is staging a revolt, and honestly, you can't blame it. Here's the part that changes everything about how you think about modern complaints. When you whine about your latte being too hot or your sandwich being slightly soggy, remember that Wu soldiers considered it a good day when their food wasn't actively moving. They dreamed about meals that were merely unpleasant, rather than potentially toxic. Your lunch introduces you to something called creamed chipped beef on toast, though the toast is more like cardboard, and the beef appears to have been processed through machinery that was last cleaned during the Civil War. The cream sauce has achieved a consistency that defies several laws of physics. It's simultaneously runny and chunky, with mysterious lumps that could be either beef or compressed sawdust. You can't tell, and frankly, you're not sure you want to know. The soldiers have nicknamed this delicacy SOS, and no, that doesn't stand for Save Our Souls, though it probably should. The actual meaning is considerably more colourful, and accurately describes both the appearance and the likely effects of consuming this particular culinary adventure. You eat it anyway because the alternative is starving, and surprisingly, starving turns out to be worse than whatever's happening in your mouth right now. What happens next will make sense of everything you thought you knew about picky eating. You realise that hunger is the world's most effective seasoning. When you haven't eaten anything substantial for 12 hours, and you've been marching through mud while people shoot at you, even the most questionable military ration starts to look appealing. Your standards adjust with remarkable speed. Food that would have made you gag last week now seems merely unpleasant, and unpleasant food starts to seem almost acceptable. But here's where most people would give up hope entirely. The dinner menu arrives, and you discover that military cooks have somehow found a way to make vegetables offensive to every human sense simultaneously. The carrots are grey, the peas have surrendered all pretense of being round, and something that might once have been corn has achieved a texture that suggests it's been pre-chewed by someone with questionable dental hygiene. The meat, and again I'm using that term with considerable generosity, has been cooked until it achieved the consistency of shoe leather, then cooked some more until it transcended shoe leather and became something entirely new. It's tough enough to use as body armour, yet somehow manages to be completely flavourless. You chew each piece for what feels like hours, wondering if you're eating food or punishment. This is where you might be thinking about all those movies where soldiers gather around warm campfires, sharing hearty stews and laughing about home. Those movies were made by people who clearly never experienced the reality of military cuisine. The closest you get to a warm campfire is a small, smoky flame that produces more smoke than heat, and the closest you get to hearty stew is whatever's left in the bottom of the pot after everyone else has eaten the identifiable pieces. Now, let's talk about what happens when the supply lines get cut off, because that's when military dining reaches new levels of creativity. When the regular shipments of questionable food stop arriving, you discover that military cooks possess an almost supernatural ability to create meals from ingredients that were never meant to be combined. They can turn a single potato, half a can of mystery meat, and some leaves they found outside into something that technically qualifies as soup, though it bears no resemblance to any soup you've ever encountered. You learn to be grateful for meals that are merely weird rather than actively dangerous. When you find a piece of actual meat in your stew, meat that you can identify as having come from a specific animal, it feels like winning the lottery. You savour that moment, because you know tomorrow's meal will probably consist of reconstituted something mixed with powdered anything and seasoned with hope. But here's where things get really interesting from a survival perspective. You start to understand why soldiers throughout history have been so resourceful. When your official rations consist of items that barely qualify as food, you become amazingly creative about supplementing your diet. You learn which plants are edible, which insects are actually quite nutritious, and which abandoned gardens might still have something growing in them. The soldiers who've been deployed longer become walking encyclopedias of alternative nutrition. They know which weeds make acceptable tea, which roots can be safely consumed, and which seemingly inedible military rations can be transformed into something almost pleasant, with the right combination of creativity and desperation. They share this knowledge like precious secrets, because in a world where your next meal is never guaranteed, information about food becomes more valuable than money. You discover that salt is the most precious commodity in the entire military. A small packet of salt can transform even the most questionable ration into something that approaches palatability. Soldiers hoard salt like dragons hoard gold, and trading a pinch of salt for a cigarette or a dry pair of socks represents serious economic activity in the military ecosystem. Here's what happens when you haven't had fresh fruit in 6 months. You start to dream about apples, not metaphorically, Literally. You have actual dreams where you're eating fresh, crisp apples, and you wake up disappointed to discover that your breakfast consists of canned peaches that have achieved the consistency of baby food and taste like sweetened cardboard. The lack of fresh food creates cravings that border on the obsessive. You find yourself thinking about your mother's vegetable garden, remembering the taste of tomatoes that were actually red and firm, rather than the pale, mushy approximations that occasionally appear in your rations. You fantasize about bread that's soft and fresh, rather than the rock-hard chunks that require soaking in coffee before they become chewable. Now, you might be thinking that at least the chocolate rations were decent. After all, how badly can you mess up chocolate? Well, military chocolate was specifically designed not to melt in hot weather, which meant it was also specifically designed not to melt in your mouth. It had the texture of sweetened wax and roughly the same flavor profile. Eating military chocolate was like consuming a candle that had been rolling around in your pocket for several weeks, picking up lint and disappointment. But wait, it gets weirder. The chocolate was also designed to be slightly unpalatable, so soldiers wouldn't eat their emergency rations unless they were truly desperate. The military brass had learned from previous wars that if you give soldiers food they actually enjoy, they'll eat it immediately rather than saving it for emergencies. So they created chocolate that was technically edible, but just unpleasant enough that you'd only eat it if you were really truly hungry. This approach to military nutrition reveals something fascinating about human psychology. When food is both scarce and unpleasant, you develop a completely different relationship with eating. Meals become purely functional. You eat to survive, not for pleasure. The concept of enjoying food becomes almost abstract, like a half-remembered luxury from a previous life. What happens next changes everything about how you think about modern food waste. In civilian life, you might throw away food that's slightly past its prime or doesn't taste quite right. In military life, you learn to be grateful for food that's merely suspicious rather than obviously dangerous. You develop an appreciation for any meal that doesn't require extensive chewing or cause immediate digestive distress. The social aspects of military dining deserve special attention. In civilian life, meals are often social occasions, opportunities to connect with family and friends over shared food experiences. In military life, meals become survival strategies. You eat quickly, efficiently, and without much conversation, because you never know when you might be interrupted by incoming artillery or orders to move out immediately. You learn to eat while walking, while hiding, and while trying not to think too hard about what you're consuming. Mealtimes become exercises in pragmatism rather than pleasure. The goal isn't to enjoy your food, it's to consume enough calories and nutrients to keep functioning until the next meal, however distant that might be. Here's where most people would start to understand why World War II veterans often became such enthusiastic cooks in peacetime. After years of eating food that was barely edible, the opportunity to prepare and consume actually pleasant meals becomes almost sacred. Veterans would often spend hours in their kitchens, lovingly preparing dishes that were everything military rations weren't: fresh, flavorful, and made with ingredients that were actually meant to be combined. But let's get back to your immediate reality as a soldier dealing with military cuisine. You're not just fighting an enemy, you're fighting your own digestive system, which has begun to view each meal as a personal attack. Your stomach has developed its own early warning system, growling ominously when it senses incoming rations and staging full-scale rebellions when you attempt to consume anything particularly questionable. The medical aspects of military nutrition become increasingly apparent as your deployment continues. You start to understand why military doctors spent so much time treating digestive issues that had nothing to do with enemy action. When your diet consists primarily of preserved, processed, and reconstituted foods, your body begins to forget how to handle fresh ingredients. The occasional piece of fresh fruit becomes almost medicinal in its effects. You discover that scurvy isn't just something that happened to pirates in history books. It's a real possibility when your diet lacks sufficient fresh fruits and vegetables. Military rations contained the minimum necessary nutrients to prevent major deficiency diseases, but preventing scurvy and maintaining optimal health turned out to be very different goals. This is where you might be thinking about modern nutritional science and wondering how military nutritionists managed to create rations that were simultaneously calorie-dense and nutritionally questionable. The answer involves a fascinating combination of wartime economics, preservation technology, and what can only be described as aggressive optimism about human adaptability. Military rations were designed to be shipped across oceans, stored in various climates, and remain edible for months or even years. This meant that taste, texture, and nutritional quality were all sacrificed in favor of shelf stability and cost efficiency. The result was food that could theoretically sustain human life indefinitely, though it couldn't guarantee that the humans being sustained would be particularly happy about it. Now, let's talk about the psychological effects of eating the same questionable food day after day, week after week. Your relationship with meals begins to change in fundamental ways. Instead of looking forward to eating, you start to approach each meal with a mixture of resignation and strategic planning. You learn which items are least offensive when eaten first, which combinations are most likely to stay down, and which rations are best saved for trading with other soldiers. The monotony of military rations creates its own form of psychological warfare. When every meal is essentially the same combination of preserved meat, starchy fillers, and vegetables that have surrendered all pretense of being fresh, eating becomes a chore rather than a pleasure. You start to understand why prisoners of war often cited the monotony of their diet as one of the most psychologically challenging aspects of their captivity. But here's where things get really interesting from an anthropological perspective. Soldiers began developing elaborate rituals around their meals, partly to combat the monotony, and partly to maintain some sense of civilization in increasingly uncivilized circumstances. They would trade rations like playing cards, creating complex economies based on personal preferences and relative desirability of different menu items. Some soldiers became legendary for their ability to transform basic rations into something approaching palatability. They would carry secret stashes of seasonings, develop techniques for combining different rations to create new flavors, and pass down cooking wisdom like family recipes. These culinary innovations became part of military folklore, passed from veteran soldiers to newcomers like sacred knowledge. You learn that creativity and desperation are powerful motivators in the kitchen. When faced with the same limited ingredients day after day, soldiers would experiment with combinations that would seem bizarre in civilian life, but made perfect sense in the context of military dining. They would mix sweet and savory rations, use coffee as a sauce base, and discover that certain rations were more palatable when eaten cold rather than heated. The heating process itself deserves special mention. Military field stoves were marvels of engineering efficiency and culinary destruction. They could heat food to scorching temperatures on the outside while leaving the center completely cold, creating meals that were simultaneously overcooked and undercooked. The temperature differential within a single portion of food could be so extreme that you needed different eating strategies for different parts of the same meal. What happens next will make you appreciate modern heating technology in ways you never imagined. When your portable stove runs out of fuel, you discover the joys of cold military rations. Cold Spam achieves new levels of unpalatability, transforming from merely unpleasant to actively offensive. Cold vegetables in gravy become an almost surreal dining experience, like eating savory pudding that's been sitting in a refrigerator for several months. But wait, there's more to consider about the social dynamics of military dining. Meals became opportunities for information sharing, rumor spreading, and psychological support. Soldiers would gather around their unappetizing rations and discuss everything from home to strategy to speculation about when the war might end. The quality of the food was universally terrible, but the shared experience of consuming it created bonds between soldiers that lasted lifetimes. These meal-based conversations served important psychological functions. When you're eating something that barely qualifies as food, commiserating with fellow sufferers helps maintain morale and sanity. Soldiers developed elaborate complaints about their rations, turning criticism of military cuisine into an art form. The worse the food, the more creative the complaints became, providing entertainment value that partially compensated for nutritional disappointment. Here's where you might start to understand the long-term effects of military dining on individual psychology. Many World War II veterans developed lifelong food preferences that were directly related to their military experiences. They would either completely avoid foods that reminded them of military rations, or they would develop almost nostalgic attachments to foods that had sustained them during difficult times. Some veterans could never eat Spam again after the war, while others consumed it regularly as a form of comfort food. The psychological associations between specific foods and wartime experiences created eating patterns that persisted for decades. Food became more than nutrition. It became a connection to shared experiences and survival memories. The irony of military nutrition becomes apparent when you consider that soldiers were often in peak physical condition, despite eating what was essentially institutional food of questionable quality. The combination of intensive physical activity, caloric restriction, and the stress of combat created bodies that could extract maximum nutrition from minimal inputs. Soldiers became incredibly efficient at processing whatever fuel they were given, even when that fuel barely qualified as food. This metabolic efficiency came at a cost, though. When veterans returned to civilian life and had access to abundant, high-quality food, many experienced digestive issues as their systems readjusted to normal nutrition. Bodies that had adapted to survival-level eating had to relearn how to handle variety, freshness, and adequate caloric intake. Now, let's talk about what happened when you got sick while eating military rations. When your immune system was already compromised by stress, limited sleep, and questionable nutrition, even minor illnesses could become serious problems. Military medical personnel became experts at treating malnutrition-related conditions that were theoretically impossible when soldiers were receiving their full ration allotments. The reality was that military rations provided enough calories and basic nutrients to prevent immediate starvation, but they weren't designed to support optimal immune function or rapid recovery from illness. Soldiers who became sick often found themselves in a cycle where poor nutrition slowed their recovery, which kept them sick longer, which further compromised their nutritional status. Here's where most people would begin to understand why access to fresh food became such a powerful morale booster for military units. When supply lines allowed for the delivery of fresh fruits, vegetables, or even fresh bread, the psychological impact was often greater than the nutritional benefit. Soldiers would describe eating fresh food as almost miraculous after months of preserved rations. The arrival of fresh supplies became legendary events in military units. Soldiers would talk about fresh apples or real eggs for weeks afterward, describing the experience in almost religious terms. These brief encounters with actual food provided psychological sustenance that was every bit as important as the nutritional benefits. But let's get back to your daily reality of trying to extract nutrition and satisfaction from military rations. You develop strategies that would seem bizarre in civilian life, but make perfect sense in the context of military survival. You learn to eat the least palatable items first, while you still have appetite and determination. You save the marginally better items for last, as a reward for getting through the meal. You discover that eating quickly reduces the amount of time you have to think about what you're consuming. The faster you eat, the less opportunity your taste buds have to register complaints. This speed eating strategy becomes so ingrained that many veterans continue eating rapidly long after returning to civilian life, unable to shake the habit of consuming food as efficiently as possible. The texture of military rations deserves special consideration. In civilian life, texture is an important component of food enjoyment. The crispness of fresh vegetables, the tenderness of properly cooked meat, the satisfying chewiness of fresh bread. Military rations existed in a parallel universe where texture was apparently considered irrelevant, or perhaps even counterproductive. Everything had the same general consistency, soft enough to eat without extensive chewing, but firm enough to maintain structural integrity during shipping and storage. The result was food that felt like it had been pre-processed by someone who had strong opinions about dental efficiency, but no understanding of human pleasure. Eating became an exercise in jaw mechanics rather than gustatory enjoyment. What happens next challenges everything you thought you knew about the relationship between food and culture. Military rations were designed to be culturally neutral, inoffensive to soldiers from different backgrounds and regions. This meant eliminating most spices, avoiding foods that might be unfamiliar to some groups, and creating meals that were so bland they couldn't possibly remind anyone of home cooking. The cultural neutrality of military food had profound psychological effects. Meals lost their connection to heritage, tradition, and identity. Food became purely functional, stripped of the emotional and cultural associations that make eating a human experience, rather than just a biological necessity. Soldiers found themselves disconnected from one of the most basic aspects of their cultural identity. This disconnection from food culture created its own form of homesickness. Soldiers would spend hours talking about specific dishes from their hometowns, describing family recipes with the kind of detail usually reserved for religious texts. The memory of culturally specific foods became a way of maintaining connection to identity and home when everything else felt foreign and dangerous. Here's where you might start to understand why food packages from home became such treasured commodities in military units. A single homemade cookie could represent weeks of trading value, not because of its nutritional content, but because it carried the taste of a home and the knowledge that someone cared enough to send it. These small connections to civilian food culture provided psychological sustenance that military rations couldn't possibly supply. The economics of military food distribution reveal fascinating insights into wartime priorities and logistics. Military rations were designed to be cost-effective in terms of shipping weight, storage requirements, and preparation time. Taste, variety, and nutritional optimization were secondary considerations if they were considered at all. The goal was to keep large numbers of people fed with minimal logistical complexity. This utilitarian approach to nutrition created some unintended consequences. Soldiers became expert at food economics, calculating the caloric and trading value of different rations with mathematical precision. They developed complex systems for optimizing their nutritional intake within the constraints of available supplies, becoming amateur nutritionists out of necessity. Now, let's consider what happened to your digestive system after months of eating the same preserved, processed foods. Your gut microbiome, the collection of bacteria that help digest food and maintain health, began to adapt to the limited variety of military rations. This adaptation was both helpful and problematic, making you more efficient at processing military food while making you less capable of handling dietary variety. When the occasional fresh food became available, many soldiers experienced digestive issues simply because their systems had adapted so completely to processed rations. Bodies that had learned to extract maximum nutrition from preserved foods sometimes struggled to handle the complexity of fresh ingredients. This created the paradoxical situation where eating better food could actually make you feel worse, at least temporarily. The long-term health effects of military dining during World War II became apparent only years later. As veterans aged and medical science developed better understanding of nutrition's role in long-term health. Many veterans experienced digestive issues, nutritional deficiencies, and food-related health problems that could be traced back to their military dining experiences. But here's where things get really interesting from a historical perspective. The experience of military dining during World War II influenced American food culture for decades afterward. Veterans returned home with different relationships to food waste, food variety, and food preparation. Many became enthusiastic home cooks, while others never fully regained their appreciation for elaborate meals. The industrial food production techniques developed for military rations eventually influenced civilian food processing. Many of the preservation and packaging methods created for military use were adapted for commercial food production, changing the way Americans ate long after the war ended. Military dining requirements drove innovations in food technology that shaped modern food culture. What happens next will make you reconsider everything you thought you knew about food appreciation. Veterans often describe their first post-war meals in terms that bordered on the mystical. The experience of eating fresh, well-prepared food after years of military rations was so intense that many veterans remembered specific meals decades later with perfect clarity. These reunion meals with real food became rites of passage, marking the transition from military to civilian life. Veterans would plan elaborate first meals, often requesting specific dishes that represented everything military rations weren't: fresh, flavorful, and prepared with care rather than efficiency. The contrast was so stark that eating became, temporarily, an almost overwhelming sensory experience. Here's where most people would start to understand the psychological complexity of military dining experiences. Food became simultaneously meaningless and incredibly meaningful. Meaningless in terms of daily pleasure and variety, but meaningful as a symbol of survival, shared hardship, and connection to home. This paradoxical relationship with food created psychological patterns that influenced veterans for the rest of their lives. Some veterans became obsessive about food waste, unable to throw away even spoiled food because they retained deep emotional memories of food scarcity. Others developed almost compulsive eating habits when food was abundant, as if their bodies were still preparing for the next period of nutritional uncertainty. The psychological impact of military dining extended far beyond the war years. The social aspects of post-war eating also deserve consideration. Veterans often found civilian dinner conversations about food preferences almost absurd after years of eating whatever was available without complaint. The luxury of choosing what to eat, when to eat, and how much to eat required psychological adjustment that could take months or years. Now, let's talk about what happened when you tried to maintain some semblance of normal eating rituals while consuming military rations. Soldiers would attempt to recreate familiar meal patterns, trying to eat breakfast foods in the morning and dinner foods in the evening, even when the actual food bore no resemblance to traditional breakfast or dinner items. These attempts at normalcy served important psychological functions, providing some structure and familiarity in an otherwise chaotic environment. The ritual of mealtime became more important than the actual meal, offering brief moments of routine and predictability in situations where nothing else was certain. But wait, there's more complexity to consider about the relationship between military food and morale. Military commanders understood that food quality directly affected fighting effectiveness and unit cohesion. Troops with better rations generally performed better in combat, had higher morale, and experienced fewer disciplinary problems. This understanding led to interesting variations in food quality based on military priorities. Elite units, or troops in particularly dangerous situations, sometimes received better rations, while rear echelon personnel made do with standard supplies. Food became both a reward system and a strategic resource, used to maintain effectiveness in critical military units. The trading economics of military food created fascinating microeconomies within military units. Soldiers would develop sophisticated systems for exchanging rations based on personal preferences, dietary restrictions, and strategic considerations. Someone who didn't smoke might trade their cigarette rations for extra food, while someone with a sweet tooth might trade their main course for dessert rations. These trading systems served important social functions beyond mere nutrition. They created networks of mutual obligation and cooperation that strengthened unit cohesion. Soldiers who consistently participated in fair trades were more trusted and better integrated into their units, while those who hoarded resources or engaged in unfair exchanges found themselves socially isolated. Here's where you might start to understand how military dining experiences shaped post-war consumer behavior. Veterans who had learned to extract maximum value from limited resources became savvy shoppers, skilled at identifying quality food and avoiding waste. Their approach to food purchasing was informed by years of experience with scarcity and the knowledge that food security wasn't guaranteed. Many veterans became excellent home cooks, not because they enjoyed cooking, but because they had learned to optimize nutrition and flavor under challenging circumstances. The skills developed while trying to make military rations palatable translated into civilian cooking abilities that impressed family and friends who had never experienced truly challenging food situations. The technological innovations driven by military food requirements had profound effects on civilian food culture. Freeze-drying, improved canning techniques, and nutritional fortification methods developed for military use eventually transformed commercial food production. Many of the processed foods that became staples of American cuisine were originally developed to meet military nutritional requirements. What happens next connects military dining experiences to broader questions about food security and nutritional equity. Veterans returned to civilian life with deep understanding of how quickly food availability could change and how important basic nutrition was for physical and psychological health. This perspective influenced everything from family meal planning to political positions on food assistance programs. Now, you might be thinking about how military dining experiences compared to civilian food rationing during the same period. While civilians dealt with shortages and substitutions, their food experiences were generally more varied and culturally connected than military rations. Soldiers were dealing with the double challenge of limited quantity and severely compromised quality. The psychological preparation for military dining was virtually non-existent. Recruits were told they would be fed regularly, but nothing in their civilian experience prepared them for the reality of military food culture. The shock of discovering that meals would be purely functional, rather than enjoyable, became part of the broader psychological adjustment to military life. This adjustment process reveals interesting aspects of human adaptability. Soldiers learned to find satisfaction in non-food aspects of mealtime: the social connection, the brief rest from military duties, the opportunity to sit down for a few minutes. When food itself couldn't provide pleasure, the ritual of eating became important for other reasons. Here's where things get really interesting from a nutritional science perspective. Military rations were designed based on the best nutritional understanding available at the time, but that understanding was limited compared to modern nutritional science. Many important nutrients were either unknown or poorly understood, leading to rations that met basic caloric needs while creating subtle deficiencies that affected long-term health. The absence of fresh foods meant that soldiers were missing not just vitamins and minerals that were known to be important, but also beneficial compounds that hadn't yet been discovered. The full nutritional complexity of fresh foods couldn't be replicated in processed rations, leading to health issues that became apparent only years later as nutritional science advanced. But let's get back to your immediate experience of trying to maintain physical and psychological health while eating military rations day after day, month after month. You develop strategies that would seem obsessive in civilian life but are essential for military survival. You learn to pay attention to your body's signals, recognizing early signs of nutritional deficiencies and adjusting your eating patterns accordingly. You become expert at identifying which rations provide the most sustained energy, which combinations are most likely to prevent digestive issues, and which items are worth saving for times when you're particularly hungry or discouraged. This personal nutrition management becomes a survival skill as important as any military training. The seasonal aspects of military dining add another layer of challenge to an already difficult situation. Cold weather makes hot food essential for maintaining body temperature, but military field stoves often can't provide adequate heating in extreme conditions. You learn to eat warm food quickly before it cools, and to appreciate any meal that's served at approximately body temperature. Hot weather creates different challenges, as preserved foods become even less appetizing when consumed in extreme heat. Military rations that are barely palatable at room temperature become nearly inedible when heated by the sun to temperatures that would be considered dangerous in civilian food service. You learn to eat quickly before your food becomes too hot to handle, literally. What happens next will change everything about how you think about food preservation technology. Military rations were marvels of engineering that could remain edible for months or years under challenging storage conditions. However, edible and pleasant to eat turned out to be very different standards, and military rations were designed to meet only the former requirement. The preservation methods used in military rations, heavy salting, chemical preservatives, extreme processing, were effective at preventing spoilage but devastating to taste, texture, and nutritional quality. Foods that could survive shipping across oceans and storage in various climates were necessarily foods that bore little resemblance to their fresh counterparts. Here's where most people would begin to understand why the development of better military rations became a priority for military researchers. The connection between food quality and military effectiveness was undeniable, leading to decades of research into creating rations that were both nutritionally adequate and psychologically acceptable. This research eventually produced the MRS, meals ready to eat, that became standard military fare in later conflicts. While still not comparable to fresh food, MREs represented significant improvements over Worcestershire rations in terms of variety, nutritional completeness, and palatability. The evolution of military food technology reflects growing understanding of the relationship between nutrition and performance. But during World War II, you were dealing with the reality of rations that were designed primarily for shelf stability and cost efficiency. Taste, variety, and nutritional optimization were luxury considerations that military budgets and logistics couldn't accommodate. You ate what was available and learned to be grateful for meals that were merely unpleasant rather than actively dangerous. The cultural impact of military dining experiences extended far beyond individual veterans to influence American food culture more broadly. The generation that served in World War II returned home with different expectations about food waste, food variety, and food preparation. Their experiences with scarcity influenced family food practices for decades. Many veterans became advocates for better nutrition programs, understanding from personal experience how inadequate nutrition affected physical and psychological health. Their political support for school lunch programs, food assistance initiatives, and nutritional research was informed by memories of military dining and its long-term effects. Now let's consider the international aspects of military dining during World War II. American soldiers deployed in different theaters encountered different supply challenges and different local food cultures. Those serving in the Pacific dealt with tropical storage conditions that made food preservation even more challenging, while those in Europe sometimes had opportunities to supplement their rations with local foods. These international experiences added complexity to military dining, as soldiers learned to navigate unfamiliar ingredients and preparation methods when official rations were unavailable. Some developed appreciation for local cuisines that influenced their post-war food preferences, while others became even more attached to familiar American foods after experiencing foreign alternatives. The logistics of military food distribution reveal fascinating insights into wartime resource management. Getting adequate food supplies to troops in combat zones required massive coordination efforts, involving everything from agricultural production to shipping schedules to transportation networks that were constantly under threat from enemy action. You begin to understand that your terrible meal isn't just the result of poor cooking. It's the end product of a supply chain that stretches back thousands of miles and involves hundreds of people whose primary goal was getting food to you alive, not getting food to you that you'd actually want to eat. The can of mystery meat you're struggling to consume travelled by ship across submarine-infested waters, was loaded and unloaded by dock workers under blackout conditions, transported by truck drivers who drove without headlights to avoid enemy bombers, and finally carried to your position by supply personnel who risked their lives to make sure you had something to eat. This perspective doesn't make the food taste any better, but it does add a layer of appreciation for the complexity of keeping armies fed during wartime. Every meal, however questionable, represents a minor miracle of logistics and determination. The fact that you're eating anything at all means that hundreds of people succeeded in their jobs despite enemy interference, equipment failures, and weather conditions that would shut down civilian supply chains entirely. But here's where things get really interesting when you consider the enemy perspective on military dining. German soldiers were dealing with their own supply challenges, often surviving on rations that made American military food look like fine dining. Japanese troops in the Pacific were frequently reduced to eating anything they could find, including tree bark and insects, as their supply lines were systematically destroyed by Allied forces. This comparative context makes your complaints about spam and hardtack seem almost luxurious. While you're grumbling about the texture of your preserved beef, enemy soldiers are literally starving. Your worst meal is still a meal, which puts you ahead of large numbers of combatants who are learning to survive on whatever they can scavenge from abandoned positions and hostile environments. The psychological warfare aspects of food scarcity become apparent when you realize that well-fed troops have significant advantages beyond simple nutrition. Soldiers with adequate food supplies have better morale, more energy for combat operations, and stronger resistance to disease. The side that can maintain better food security often wins conflicts through attrition, as poorly fed troops become less effective fighters and more susceptible to surrender. What happens next will make you reconsider everything you thought you knew about the relationship between food and military strategy. Controlling food supplies becomes as important as controlling ammunition supplies, and disrupting enemy food distribution networks becomes a primary military objective. Your boring military rations represent strategic resources that enemies are actively trying to deny you. Now, you might be thinking that at least officers ate better than enlisted personnel. While there were some differences in officer rations, the reality was that everyone in combat zones was dealing with essentially the same food limitations. A lieutenant eating the same spam and hardtack as his troops created shared experiences that built unit cohesion, even if that shared experience was collectively complaining about military cuisine. The democratic nature of military food, equally bad for everyone, served important social functions within military units. When everyone from the commanding officer to the newest recruit was dealing with the same dietary challenges, it created a sense of shared sacrifice that strengthened military culture. Food became a great equalizer, reminding everyone that they were all in the same difficult situation together. Here's where you start to understand the long-term health consequences of military dining during extended deployments. Your body begins to show signs of adaptation to limited nutritional variety, changes in energy levels, digestive patterns, and even immune function. Some of these adaptations are helpful for short-term survival, but they create problems when sustained over months or years. Military medical personnel became expert at recognizing and treating nutrition-related health issues that were theoretically impossible when soldiers were receiving full rations. The difference between theoretical nutritional adequacy and practical nutritional outcomes became apparent as doctors dealt with everything from minor vitamin deficiencies to serious digestive disorders caused by the monotony and processing methods of military food. The seasonal variations in food availability add another dimension to military dining challenges. Spring and summer deployments sometimes offered opportunities to supplement rations with foraged foods, wild berries, edible plants, or vegetables from abandoned gardens. These brief encounters with fresh food provided both nutritional and psychological benefits that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Winter deployments, however, eliminated most opportunities for dietary supplementation, while simultaneously increasing caloric needs for maintaining body temperature. Cold weather made hot food essential for morale and health, but also made food preparation more challenging and fuel consumption more critical. You learn to appreciate any warm meal, regardless of its other qualities. But let's talk about what happened to your taste preferences after months of eating the same limited selection of processed foods. Your palate begins to adapt in ways that would seem bizarre in civilian life. Foods that initially seemed inedible become merely unpleasant, and foods that were merely unpleasant start to seem almost acceptable. Your standards adjust with remarkable speed when the alternatives are hunger or starvation. This adaptation process reveals fascinating aspects of human sensory plasticity. When exposed to limited flavor profiles for extended periods, your taste buds become more sensitive to subtle variations within that limited range. You learn to distinguish between different batches of the same ration, recognizing which preparations are marginally better than others, and developing preferences based on tiny differences that would be imperceptible to someone with access to varied foods. What happens next challenges everything you thought you knew about food memory and psychological comfort. Surprisingly, some soldiers developed nostalgic attachments to specific military rations, not because they tasted good, but because they were associated with survival, camaraderie, and shared experiences. The terrible food became connected to powerful memories of overcoming challenges and supporting fellow soldiers. These psychological associations with military food created complex post-war relationships with eating. Some veterans could never tolerate foods that reminded them of military rations, while others sought out similar foods as comfort items that connected them to meaningful experiences. The same spam that was cursed during wartime became, for some, a reminder of survival and brotherhood. Here's where most people would start to understand the broader cultural impact of military dining experiences on American food culture. The generation that served in World War II returned home with different attitudes toward food waste, food preparation, and food appreciation. Their experiences with scarcity influenced family food practices, consumer behavior, and even political positions on nutrition programs for decades. Veterans often became advocates for better institutional food programs, understanding from personal experience how food quality affected morale, health, and performance. Their support for school lunch programs, hospital food improvements, and nutritional research was informed by memories of military dining and its effects on individual and group well-being. The technological innovations driven by military food requirements had lasting effects on civilian food culture. Preservation methods, packaging techniques, and nutritional fortification approaches developed for military use eventually transformed commercial food production. Many processed foods that became staples of American cuisine were originally developed to meet military specifications for shelf stability and nutritional adequacy. Now, let's consider what happened when supply lines were completely cut off, and you had to survive on whatever food remained in your immediate area. This is when military dining reached new levels of creativity and desperation. Soldiers learned to make soup from leather boots, brew tea from pine needles, and create surprisingly nutritious meals from ingredients that were never intended for human consumption. These extreme survival food experiences taught lessons about nutrition and resourcefulness that influenced veterans for the rest of their lives. Soldiers who learned to extract nutrition from nearly inedible sources returned to civilian life with deep appreciation for food security and remarkable skills at minimizing food waste. They could transform leftovers and scraps into satisfying meals with techniques learned during their most desperate moments. The foraging skills developed during military service often became lifelong interest for veterans. Many continued to supplement their diets with wild foods long after returning to civilian life, not from necessity but from knowledge gained during military service. The ability to identify edible plants, prepare unusual proteins, and create meals from minimal ingredients became practical skills that served them throughout their lives. But here's where things get really interesting from a psychological perspective. The experience of being truly hungry, not just wanting a snack, but genuinely uncertain about when your next meal would arrive, created lasting changes in how veterans related to food and eating. The knowledge that food security isn't guaranteed influenced everything from meal planning to political positions on social safety nets. Many veterans developed what could be called food anxiety, persistent worry about having adequate food supplies even when living in food-secure environments. They would stockpile non-perishable foods, become upset about food waste, and feel genuine distress when meals were delayed or uncertain. These responses were rational adaptations to wartime conditions that persisted long after the original threat had passed. What happens next will make you reconsider everything you thought you knew about the relationship between food and identity. Military dining stripped away most of the cultural and personal associations that make food meaningful beyond simple nutrition. Meals lost their connections to heritage, tradition, and individual preference, becoming purely functional activities focused on survival rather than satisfaction. This disconnection from food culture had profound effects on personal identity and psychological well-being. Food is one of the primary ways humans maintain connections to their cultural backgrounds and express individual preferences. When meals become standardized, processed, and culturally neutral, people lose an important source of personal and cultural identity. The reintegration into civilian food culture after military service required psychological adjustment that could take months or years. Veterans had to relearn how to make food choices based on preference rather than necessity, how to enjoy meals rather than simply consume them, and how to reconnect with the cultural and emotional aspects of eating that had been suppressed during military service. Here's where you might start to understand why food became such an important symbol of civilian life for returning veterans. The ability to choose what to eat, when to eat, and how much to eat represented fundamental freedoms that had been absent during military service. Simple decisions like selecting ingredients at a grocery store or choosing items from a restaurant menu became powerful symbols of personal autonomy and civilian identity. Many veterans described their first post-war restaurant meals in almost mystical terms. The experience of having multiple options, eating food that was prepared specifically for enjoyment rather than mere survival, and consuming meals in pleasant social environments was so different from military dining that it felt like entering a different world entirely. The contrast between military and civilian food experiences was so stark that it often created temporary eating disorders as veterans readjusted to food abundance and choice. Some experienced anxiety when faced with too many options, while others ate compulsively when high-quality food was available, as if their bodies were still preparing for the next period of scarcity. Now, let's talk about the long-term health effects of military dining that became apparent years or decades after the war ended. Veterans who had survived on processed rations for extended periods often experienced digestive issues, nutritional deficiencies, and food-related health problems that could be traced back to their military experiences. The limited variety of military rations meant that soldiers missed not just known nutrients, but also beneficial compounds that hadn't yet been discovered by nutritional science. The full complexity of fresh foods couldn't be replicated in processed rations, leading to subtle health issues that became apparent only as veterans aged and medical understanding of nutrition advanced. Some veterans developed lifelong digestive sensitivities to processed foods, as if their systems had learned to associate highly processed items with the stress and poor nutrition of military service. Others became almost obsessive about consuming fresh fruits and vegetables, making up for years of nutritional limitations with eating patterns that prioritized fresh, minimally processed foods. But here's where things get really interesting from a sociological perspective. The shared experience of military dining created bonds between veterans that persisted for decades after the war ended. Veterans could immediately connect with each other by discussing their memories of specific rations, sharing stories about creative ways to make military food palatable, and commiserating about the long-term effects of institutional dining. These food-based memories became important components of veteran identity and community. Reunions and veteran gatherings often featured discussions about military rations, with participants sharing techniques for improving terrible food and laughing about shared experiences of culinary suffering. The terrible food became a source of camaraderie and shared identity, rather than just negative memories. The cultural impact of military dining experiences extended beyond individual veterans to influence broader American attitudes toward food and nutrition. The generation that served in World War II brought home deep understanding of the relationship between nutrition and performance, leading to increased support for nutritional research, better institutional food programs, and more sophisticated understanding of food security issues. What happens next connects military dining experiences to broader questions about food policy and social responsibility. Veterans who had experienced food scarcity and poor nutrition firsthand became advocates for better food assistance programs, understanding from personal experience how inadequate nutrition affected physical and psychological health. Their political support for school lunch programs, senior nutrition services, and food assistance initiatives was informed by memories of military dining and its effects on individual and community well-being. The knowledge that food security wasn't guaranteed made veterans strong supporters of social safety nets that included nutritional components. Here's where most people would begin to understand the full scope of how military dining experiences shaped post-war American culture. The effects extended far beyond individual dietary preferences to influence everything from food production methods to social policy decisions to cultural attitudes toward waste and abundance. The generation that experienced military dining brought home appreciation for food security, understanding of the relationship between nutrition and performance, and commitment to ensuring that future generations wouldn't face similar nutritional challenges. Their influence on American food culture was profound and lasting, affecting everything from family meal practices to institutional food policies. Now, as we reach the end of this exploration of military dining during World War II, you might be thinking about how these experiences compare to modern military food or contemporary food challenges. While current military rations are significantly improved in terms of variety, nutritional completeness, and palatability, the basic challenges of maintaining adequate nutrition under stressful conditions remain relevant. The lessons learned from World War II military dining continue to influence military food research, emergency food planning, and our understanding of the relationship between nutrition and human performance. The experiences of World War II soldiers eating terrible food under impossible conditions provide insights that remain valuable for anyone interested in nutrition, psychology, or human resilience. Your journey through the world of World War II military dining reveals truths about human adaptability, the importance of food security, and the complex relationships between nutrition, psychology, and social connection. The soldiers who survived on Spam and hardtack didn't just endure terrible food. They demonstrated remarkable human capacity for adaptation and survival, under conditions that would challenge anyone's physical and psychological resources. The next time you complain about your coffee being too cold, or your sandwich being slightly soggy, remember the soldiers who considered it a good day when their food wasn't actively moving, and who learned to find satisfaction in meals that barely qualified as edible. Their experiences remind us that food is both more and less important than we usually think. Less important because humans can survive on surprisingly little, but more important because adequate nutrition affects every aspect of human performance and well-being. The story of World War II military dining is ultimately a story about human resilience, the power of shared hardship to create lasting bonds, and the complex ways that extreme experiences shape individual and cultural identity. It's a reminder that the generation that fought World War II didn't just face enemy bullets. They also faced daily challenges that tested their physical and psychological limits in ways that most of us will never fully understand. And perhaps most importantly, it's a testament to the fact that humans can adapt to almost anything when survival depends on it, finding ways to maintain hope, humor, and humanity even when eating food that would make modern prisoners riot. The soldiers who choked down military rations day after day, month after month, demonstrated a form of heroism that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with the simple, persistent courage required to keep going when everything, even your food, is working against you.